Hi everyone, and welcome back. In this lecture, we'll take a look at some of the formatting changes that we can make to our pivot tables in Excel. For this lecture, we'll use the same spreadsheet as before, but so that we can get some extra practice creating pivot tables, we'll start again from the raw dataset. Let's go through and create another pivot table from our data. So again, we'll start by formatting our data as a table, and I'm using the Ctrl+T shortcut that we covered last time. And then, with our data formatted, we can go to the Insert tab and select Pivot Table. So we'll select Table 1 for our data, and then our output will be a new worksheet again. Perfect. And now let's add some data. So I'll add the genre into our rows, and then the score into our values. And we'll change this to show the average instead of the sum. And then we'll change our formatting to just show one decimal point. So this is now a similar setup to what we had last time, except that now we're looking at the average for the entire genre as opposed to just by year. Before we go any further, I'd like to show you something that I missed out in the last lecture. Currently, we just have the genre in our rows. We could, however, drag in, let's say, the years to our rows too. So let's get our year column and drag it into rows. And then if we hover over the top of our genre column, we'll see that we get a green line. And now, if we let go of our mouse, it will add in the years as our main level. But then within this level, we can see the average score for each genre too. So before we had the average for each genre across the entire number of years, whereas now we get to see the average for each genre within a particular year. So for 1980, the average of the action genre was 6.2. And for 1981, the average of the action genre was 6.5. When you add in an additional level to your pivot table, Excel automatically expands each field. But if you want to minimize them and expand only the selected fields, we can do that by selecting one of these fields. So I'll just select 1980. And then in the Pivot Table Analyze tab, you have a button here to collapse the field. And that collapses all items of the active field. So if you click on this, that'll then collapse all of our years here. And we can maximize any years we want to have a look at in more detail. If we drag the years down below our genre, we then get the genre as our main level, and then we can see for each genre how the average score has changed over different years. I'll now undo this, but I just wanted to show you that it is possible to add in different levels to our pivot table. Okay, and moving on. Previously, we've looked at conditional formatting and how that can help us to spot the patterns and trends in a dataset. But we can also use conditional formatting within our pivot tables as well. And let's apply some conditional formatting to our average rating for our different genres now. Like before, we'll start by selecting the cell range, which here will be from cell B4 through to cell B22. And then on our Home tab, we'll select our conditional formatting button, and I'll apply a color scale to this so that we can easily pick out what a good rating is and what a bad rating is within our dataset. So here we can see that the history genre has the highest average rating of 8.3, and then the Western genre has the lowest average rating of 5.7. If we drag our year into the columns area, with the conditional formatting now applied, we'll be able to easily see for each genre how its average rating has changed year on year. And alternatively, we could swap our genre and year round, so put the genre into columns and our year into rows. Now we get the same data, but presented in a different format. So let's now remove the genre from our columns. And let's say here that we want to rename our current average of score column to just be simply called score. We can change our column names by either editing it in our formula bar up here, or alternatively by double-clicking on the cell and changing the name in here. If you try and set this to score, we get an error saying that the pivot table field name already exists. This is because score is already one of our columns in our dataset, and you can see this over here in our list of columns. If you really wanted to change the column name to match what's in our dataset, so here for instance, we really wanted to call the average of score column simply score, we could add in a space to the end of our name, and that will give it the same name visually. I've gone ahead here and made a few changes to our pivot table. So I've added in the genre into our rows, the sum of our gross amount into the values, and then the rating into our columns. And the rating is just the age classification of the film. Let's now explore the two tabs up here at the top of our worksheet, the Pivot Table Analyze and the Design tab. The Design tab provides us with options to refine the visual presentation of our pivot table. And the main options within here are the subtotals and grand totals, the Pivot Table Style Options group, and the Pivot Table Styles group. And starting from the left, the subtotals option allows us to toggle the inclusion of subtotal rows or columns for each category within our pivot table. For example, if we introduced the year column into our rows, enabling subtotals would provide a row providing the sum of all the gross revenue for each age rating within a particular year. The grand totals option creates a grand total for either the row, the column, or both. If we enable it for both, we'll get a new column in column O, which shows the grand total of the sum for each row, and then a new row in row 24, which shows the grand total for each column. Next, we'll have a look at the pivot table styles. These are predefined formatting options that allow us to quickly and easily change the style of our pivot tables. We can find the list of all the different options available here in the drop-down menu, different levels of color intensity. And I'll just select the first light green option here. In addition to the predefined pivot table styles, you can also fine-tune the appearance of your pivot table using various style options. We have the row headers, which enables custom formatting for any row headers you might have, but in this case, we don't have any row headers in our pivot table. The column headers, which does the same, but for any column headers, which we can see the change here. And then finally, our banded rows and banded columns. And these last two automatically vary the color tone between rows or columns to help us visually differentiate between the start and end of individual rows or columns. Next, we'll explore the options in our Pivot Table Analyze tab. The main features to know about in this tab are the slicer, and then finally, for some extra customization, the field list, the plus/minus buttons, and finally the field headers over here off to the right in our show group. We'll start by having a look at the slicer, and this provides us with yet another way to further analyze our data. So with our current data here, we could insert a slicer using our director column, and then with this, we can look at the gross revenue for all the films in our dataset, but only where the director is George Lucas. So here we have a list of all the different directors in our dataset, and we can select just one or as many as we like. And then with George Lucas selected, if we double click on the grand total cell, that will open up a new worksheet containing all the movies where George Lucas is listed as the director. Finally, we'll move on to our show group, and the first of these options is the field list button, and this toggles the visibility of the pivot table fields pane, which, as we know, is where we can select the data for our pivot tables. If you happen to accidentally close this pane, you can reopen it from here. And next, we have the plus and minus buttons. When dealing with multi-layered pivot tables, such as when we have multiple columns in our rows area, these buttons allow us to toggle the presence of the expand or minimize buttons for each level, as we can see them disappear and reappear here. The final option in this group is the field headers button, and this allows us to enable or disable the field headings within our pivot table. And I usually disable this option as it provides a cleaner presentation, as is illustrated here by the removal of the row labels heading in cell A4. The very last thing we'll look at in this lecture is how we can better deal with empty cells within our pivot tables. We have quite a lot of empty cells in this pivot table, so it would be good to fill all these empty cells in with a string or number to signify that there's no data available. To do this, we'll right-click anywhere inside of our pivot table and then go to the Pivot Tables option menu. From within here, we'll check the For Empty Cells Show checkbox, and in the input box here, we can provide our message. So I'll just say no data. And then if we hit OK, we can see that all of our empty cells have now been filled with the no data message. Okay, and that's everything there for our lecture on pivot table formatting. In the next one, we'll introduce pivot charts, which are a powerful extension of the core functionality of pivot tables and allow us to visualize the data in an interactive manner. So I'll see you in the next lecture.